This is an exemplar answer to question 4A, Cambridge International Advanced Level Economics, Paper 4-2, February-March 2021, essay question on transfer earnings, economic rent and elasticity of supply. The question is: distinguish between transfer earnings and economic rent. With the help of diagrams, consider the links between transfer earnings, economic rent, the elasticity of supply of labor and an individual worker's wage rate. 12 marks. The question has 3 parts. Part 1. Distinguish between transfer earnings and economic rent. Part 2. With the help of diagrams, consider the link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and the elasticity of supply of labor. Part 3. Consider the link between the elasticity of supply of labor and the individual's wage rate. First part of the question. Distinguish between transfer earnings and economic rent. For the first part of the question, the following should be considered. Definitions of transfer earnings and economic rent. Use a graph to show transfer earnings and economic rent. Explain the differences between transfer earnings and economic rent. The definitions of transfer earnings and economic rent are as follows. Transfer earnings is the minimum payment required to keep a factor of production, such as labor in its current use. Economic rent is any payment to a factor above the transfer earnings. A graph showing transfer earnings and economic rent. In Figure 1 below, the total earnings is WAQB. Transfer earnings is represented by triangle AQB, below the supply of labor curve. The triangle WAB, above the supply of labor curve, is the economic rent. Differences between transfer earnings and economic rent. Transfer earnings is the lowest pay a worker requires in order to continue to work in an industry. It represents the minimum amount he would earn if he takes up the next best alternative job. If he is offered an amount below the transfer earnings, he will move to the next best alternative job. Any amount a worker receives in excess of transfer earnings is the economic rent. A worker is usually paid economic rent if demand for labor exceeds the supply of labor, or if he has special skills. A worker continues to work as long as the transfer earnings is paid, even though he receives no economic rent. The second part of the question. With the help of diagrams, consider the link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and the elasticity of supply of labor. The second part of the question is done as follows. Define elasticity of supply of labor, and state the meaning of relatively elastic and inelastic labor supply. Explain the link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and inelastic labor supply, using a diagram. Use a diagram to explain the link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and elastic labor supply. Definition of elasticity of supply of labor, and the meaning of relatively elastic and inelastic labor supply. It is written in this way. Elasticity of supply of labor is the measure of responsiveness of quantity of labor supplied to a change in the wage rate. Supply of labor is relatively elastic if a percentage change in wage rate results in a greater percentage change in quantity supplied. Relatively inelastic labor supply occurs when a change in wage rate results in a smaller percentage change in the quantity of labor supplied. The link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and inelastic labor supply. It is written as follows. The more inelastic the supply of labor is, the greater the economic rent. In Figure 2 below, supply is relatively inelastic, the economic rent is greater than the transfer earnings. If the labor supply is perfectly inelastic, all earnings is economic rent as in Figure 3. The supply of labor is perfectly inelastic, because this kind of worker or labor has a rare skill, e.g., superstar footballers, like Lionel Messi. The graphs showing relatively inelastic and perfectly inelastic supply of labor. The link between transfer earnings, economic rent, and elastic labor supply. If the supply of labor is relatively elastic, like in a low-skilled job that has plenty people who can do it, because no special skill is required, transfer earnings makes up a greater proportion of the earnings, while the smaller part is economic rent, figure 4 below. If labor supply is perfectly elastic, all earnings is transfer earnings, figure 5 below. The graphs showing relatively elastic and perfectly elastic supply of labor. The third part of the question. Consider the link between the elasticity of supply of labor and the individual's wage rate. Elasticity of supply of labor and the individual's wage rate. It is written as follows. Low-skilled jobs have a relatively elastic supply of labor as the skill requirement is low. The labor supply will increase by a greater percentage, following a rise in the wage rate as more people from other industries can easily join the industry. Consequently, they command a lower wage rate. There is a barrier to entry into the industry if supply is relatively inelastic as more skills, training, or time is required to join the industry. So, higher wages are paid to them, since there is no ample supply of labor from other industries. The conclusion. State your opinion. Support it. Consider, it depends on. It is as follows. However, the wages paid may not be related to the elasticity of supply of labor. Workers may be paid a higher wage rate based on race, nationality, gender, or religious orientation. In addition, a unionized worker stands the chance of obtaining a higher wage due to collective bargaining than a non-unionized worker. This has nothing to do with the labor supply elasticity. Even if the supply is elastic, regional differences in the cost of living and dangerous working conditions may be considered in wage determination. In addition, low-skilled workers may be paid a little above transfer earnings to motivate them, when there is a shortage in a particular region. Supply of labor, generally, depends on the time period. It tends to be more inelastic in the short run than the long run, because time is required to acquire relevant skills and get ready for employment. The whole essay, putting all together. First paragraph. The graph showing economic rent and transfer earnings. The body. The body. The body. The graph showing relatively inelastic and perfectly inelastic supply of labor. The body. The graph showing relatively elastic and perfectly elastic supply of labor. The body. The conclusion.